All right, so pretty much what we're going to do is we're going to dive into ZBrush, and we'll start with the introduction to the UI, an introduction to sculpting, to the toolbox, and then we'll also get into starting to sculpt. And then again, if we have time, we'll talk about exporting it to Maya and other cool things that we can do with ZBrush. So as soon as you open ZBrush, you'll start to notice that there's a lot going on. So you have your lightbox, which is this little thingy here. This is pretty much like a file organizer, file manager. It's pretty cool. It has a lot of different preset projects and stuff that you can use to get started. Um, but putting away the toolbox for now, we'll notice up here is the title bar, and you can see there's so many different options. It's really overwhelming, honestly. But for the sake of the beginning tutorial, we don't really need to mess with anything other than it is file over here, which is just saving and all that stuff. And then we also have tool over here, which has different tools and stuff that we'll get into. And not tools in the sense of like sculpting, but tools more in a sense of the different objects that make up your file. We'll get into that later, but for now, we're just going to talk about the UI and get familiarized with all the different buttons and gadgets we got going on here. So actually, let's just dive right into the toolbox. So if we want to compare this to Photoshop, the tool menu is kind of like the files within your file. So if we go to our lightbox and we start with our basic scene, which is just like a little sphere, you can pick any of them, honestly. We'll load this up here. We'll notice that we have the tools over here. So the tool menu is like files in Photoshop. You can have a bunch of different files open at once in Photoshop, and you can have a bunch of different tools open here in ZBrush. So if we want to think of it like a hierarchy, we have our ZBrush file that we open to start our projects. It's kind of like a master file. It's like a Photoshop window, not even a Photoshop file. It's like a Photoshop window where we have a bunch of different files within a master file. And so you'll notice all these different other things here, and we're like, what the heck is all this? So these are called poly mesh 3Ds. So these are going to be, if we think about it like Photoshop again, we have them as files within a window. So one poly mesh 3D is like a whole object within a file. Does that is that making sense? It's really confusing to get at first, but once you see how everything starts to work together when you start to sculpt, everything starts kind of falling in place and it makes a lot more sense. And you're probably thinking, okay, we have all these files within a file, but we can only view one of them at a time, which is kind of weird, right? And you're kind of stuck with only one object per file, which is really weird. But then ZBrush has these things, and they're called subtools, which is honestly kind of just like layers in Photoshop. If we want to compare it to Photoshop, um, subtools within our polymesh 3D objects selections here, we can see that, oh, sorry. We can see that all of these have subtools, which are kind of like layers for Photoshop. So a subtool is all of the different objects within the scene. And what's really nice about this is that I'm in symmetry mode right now. You'll notice that every time I do something, up here is a slider. Every single layer has its own history, which is it takes a lot to get used to, but it actually becomes really useful when you have so many different objects within your file. Because let's say you're working on a face, and then you work on the background of your like miniature, whatever you're working on, and somewhere down the line you're like, I kind of like the old version of this face. So instead of having to undo and undo and undo all of your hard work, you can actually just go to the object that is the face, and you can go back in time with the history. We love history. Tessa says, OMG history in my sculpting software. Okay, Blender is lacking here. Yeah, honestly, I'm such a big fan of the history in ZBrush. It has saved my life a couple times, I'm not gonna lie. And so when we move back to our subtools, it's kind of, remember we were talking about how everything is kind of every single subtool is a different object, it's a different layer. And in the same sense, you can merge layers, you can split layers, you can delete them, duplicate them, all that good stuff. So let's go back to, we have our ZBrush file with all of our polymesh 3Ds, and each one has the different subtools. It's really cool that you can have all of these different things within one ZBrush file. Kind of like if you wanted to quickly switch between things as like reference or all that good stuff, it's really nice. All right. And so in terms of the UI, the top shelf, we got all these different things here. You know, we got the light box, we got the home page. We'll talk about live boolean later if we have time. And we've got all kinds of stuff up here, like brush settings, the amount of points in your file over here, which is vertices. So something really cool about ZBrush is in comparison to other 3D sculpting like software, is that it's by points and not vertices. So in ZBrush, you're actually working in 2.5D, which is kind of a little disorienting at first. But as you get used to it, you get to learn like how things will transfer over. It seems very sketchy, but trust me, it's very useful to have it as points instead of vertices. So instead of traditional 3D, we have 2.5D, which means you can have files with upwards of like 35 million points. You can have these very high quality scenes, and your computer will just be like, this is easy sauce. Honestly, if you had something, if you were working in Maya, if you were working in Blender, and you had 35 million points, your computer would be like crashing and burning. But in ZBrush, 35 million points is like nothing because it's working in 2.5D. So it is 2D every time you move around, but you have your points in 3D that are being like, I don't quote unquote rendered as you move around. So it's very smooth and very optimized and very useful for sculpting. All right. So now we'll move on to, we've gone through our all these different options up here. We got our top shelf, we got the subtools and all that stuff. On here on the left is our left shelf. Technically it's called that. It's kind of weird, but we have access to sculpting brushes, strokes, alphas, and materials and such, which we'll talk about another time, not today. Um, so you have like brushes that there's so many here, and it's very, very scary. um, but there are only a couple that you can get away with using. I honestly only use like 5 brushes, and all the other ones are pretty much there for different specialties things. The stroke is how you want your brush to be applied onto the mesh. And the alpha is sort of like a textured brush. If you were to draw with this one, you'll see that it, oh, sorry. You probably need a higher resolution one here, but you can see how it's kind of putting that stencil like on there, kind of like Substance Painter does. Tessa asks, can you upload custom brushes or brushes you download online? And yeah, there's a lot of different really cool options online that you can install. There's a lot of like really nice ones for making stylized sculptures and all that stuff. And you can download a lot of different things online that'll let you do a bunch of different functions and stuff to your models. The same thing goes for Alpha. You can install so many different stencils, if you want to call them that, to draw on your character. Kind of like if you had pores that you wanted to sculpt onto a character's face, that would be really powerful. Instead of having to go in and do 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, you can just make a stencil and you can paint it on your model. It's really cool. All right, and then now that we have pretty much everything UI related talked about, the right shelf has a bunch of different settings for navigation, viewing, and wireframes, grids, and all that good stuff. We'll get into navigation in just a second, but if you're ever lost and need to just move around quickly, like say you're used to using a mouse and keyboard, or if you're used to using a tablet, you can use these as a backup to kind of move around, zoom in, rotate, and frame your objects. Like if you're trying to show someone something without your tablet and you're super used to using your tablet, it's really good as like a backup, so you don't have to memorize those navigation tools. But for the sake of going over them, the navigation is kind of similar to Maya. It's kind of like a mixture between Blender and Maya, honestly. So a free rotate is just clicking and dragging the background. Moving is Alt and click the background. And there's a bunch of different cool things that you can do. Personally, I use a tablet, so I'm used to just clicking, moving around, all that good stuff. There's a bunch of different cool things that you can do with a tablet, like having custom buttons and all that. But in terms of navigation, you always have these as a background, which is really nice when you're coming from a bunch of different 3D programs that are all so used to the Maya way of moving around. And you come in here and you're like, okay, what the heck is happening? Um, like with all software, it'll come naturally after you spend a bit of time moving around in the software and accessing the tools. It'll kind of just be like, oh, where's this? And you'll kind of remember that hierarchy of the different tools and all that when you're working. All right, so now that we've pretty much moved around our UI, gotten used to all the different functions in here, we can start sculpting. Um, there's a lot of different things that are going to hinder you when it comes to sculpting. For example, you open up brushes and you see all these different brushes and you're like, oh God, what the heck? There's too much here. Um, so you'll basically pretty much always use the standard brush for normal drawing, just kind of like that. And then I'll go to the move tool. This kind of like pinches and drags the different things in different directions wherever you pull it, kind of just moving those vertices, kind of like the soft selection tool in Maya. And then you also have the pinch tool, which will pull in the vertices together. It's really nice for making sharp edges around maybe like the eyelids or anything that really uses a hard edge. And then you'll also be using the damn standard tool a lot. It's really helpful when it comes to making sharp edges inward compared to the pinch outward. And of course, you can use Alt to redirect it. You'll do the opposite of whatever brush you're doing if you hold down Alt. It's very similar to Maya and also Blender and Sculpting. And then you'll also, if you get to the point, you can use the inflate tool. Inflate has no E at the end, which is kind of silly, but not to be confused with the normal standard tool that we're using. The inflate kind of just exaggerates the different shapes that you have going on. And you also have polish, which is good for flattening edges. You can't really see it on here because I don't have any hard defined edges here, but it is very cool. There's so many different things in here, but honestly, the only ones that you're using are standard, move, pinch, damn standard, inflate, polish, and the last one, which is used sometimes, is the clay buildup, which if you're used to working with normal clay, you'll notice that it kind of works like that. It's very, very nice for making organic stuff with this kind of organic clay manipulation. All right. And so now that we've pretty much looked at all of the brushes that we have access to and the ones that we'll mainly be using, we can talk about the materials which help you view your geometry and stuff in different lighting. Well, not really lighting, but more different materials that you would be applying to it. Um, we don't really need to talk about them too much, but they're very nice when it comes to viewing how it might look in the future. I personally just use the gray one. Some people use the red one or all these different options. This one's really useful when it comes to where things are facing, but mainly you can just focus on the gray one. So now that we are getting ready to start sculpting, there's a couple different keybinds that are very widely used, I guess I would say. So we already talked about how if we go back to our standard brush, we can use Alt to reverse it. And then you see how we have symmetry on, it's kind of by default on these pre-made sphere projects. But if you press X, you can activate or deactivate the symmetry, which is really nice. Pretty much, I work almost all the time in symmetry except for when I'm making just asymmetrical details on a character. It's very useful when it comes later down to making symmetrical characters, like the base character anatomy to reg later. It's very just chill. But we got the asymmetry, and we can just press X to activate symmetry, which is pretty cool. All right. And so when we're working with sculpting, let's say we're using the clay buildup tool, and we're kind of just like, okay, I got this basic like lump here, but it's kind of looking a little crunchy-licious. So one thing that I really love about ZBrush is instead of switching to a different brush or hitting a bunch of different buttons, if you wanted to smooth out a surface, you can actually just hold down Shift, and you'll see that it automatically turns it to the smooth function. So you can hold down Shift and you can just draw over it and it'll smooth it out. You don't need to select anything else. We just got to hold down Shift while we draw, which is really, really nice and convenient when it comes to making little details and smoothing them out and all that different good stuff for when we're modeling and sculpting. All right. And so you'll notice that when we hit down Shift, it moves us to a different tool. And you're probably wondering, what the heck? How do we... Well, some of these tools in here will actually change your smooth function to a different kind of smooth or a different anything else that you've got programmed in there. You don't really worry about that too much until we get into more like advanced crazy stuff, but if you hold down Shift, it goes to smooth. But what happens if you hit Control? You'll notice that sometimes when you're hitting Control Z, it'll pop up with a mask pen. What this actually does is if we go to our standard, and you see how we have this selection right here, when we hit Control, it brings us into mask mode. So anything masked will not be movable until you deselect the mask. So it's super useful when you want to edit a part of your object without affecting like a certain area. It's very similar to just selection in Photoshop. You can mask things to do a bunch of different functions to them, which we won't get into just now. But the control, when you hold down Control, it makes it an active brush masking mode. Anything dark gray is unmovable. And similarly, remember how we were pressing Alt to invert our brush? You can hit Control and Alt to unselect parts of your mask. So you can hold down Control to select, but say you wanted to precisely come in here and draw like a little pattern, you can hit Control and Alt to deselect this certain part, which is really useful for making certain details and all that good stuff. And let's say you got like a crazy mask that you've worked on and you've done all you want with it, and you're like, how can I like deselect everything? It's very cool. If you hold down Control and you select out here, you'll notice that we get this kind of box. I'm holding down right now, kind of like a normal like rectangle selection tool in Photoshop. If we select nothing out here, boom, everything's gone, which is really cool. And you can also use the square to kind of select different parts of it, but I honestly just use this to deselect everything. And let's say, okay, I've selected this, but what if I only want to edit this part and not the outside part? If you just click on the outside instead of, remember how we can click and drag? When we're clicking and dragging outside of here, it's kind of, it's like, hey, let's select everything in here only, but there's nothing in here, so it's just not going to select anything. But if you just simply click while holding down Control, it'll invert it. So now we can only edit this part in here. And it's very cool. Lots of powerful stuff going on here. And so now that we have pretty much our basic tools to start sculpting, you may be wondering, what if I blocked out a character in Maya and I've exported it as a FBX or an OBJ? You want to bring it in here. Well, something really cool is always duplicate your layer before you import, because sometimes it can override your current tool. But you can import your objects into here from Maya, whether it's an OBJ, FBX, all that good stuff. And remember how I was talking about how a ZBrush file is kind of like a master window in Photoshop, and you have different files open within Photoshop. Those are your polymesh 3Ds. So if you remember from class, an FBX file has like a bunch of different objects in it, a bunch of different materials and all that good stuff. Well, an OBJ file is pretty much simpler. An FBX file will import often as a polymesh 3D. So it'll actually make a new one in here for you to reference while you use your other polymesh 3D objects in here. So it'll import your FBX file in here, and all the different objects that you've crafted within Maya to bring into ZBrush will show up as subtools. The different objects that are making up your FBX file will become those layers, sort of like in here as subtools. And so if you just wanted something like simple, like say you model like a shoe to put on your character in Maya, I personally prefer to make clothes in Maya and then bring them into here before I make them more refined. What you can do is you can just export it as an OBJ and it'll import as a subtool instead of making a whole new polymesh 3D set of subtools. You can just import here like a normal layer within Photoshop kind of. So importing a subtool will overwrite the current subtool that you have selected. So as a backup, I always recommend appending. You can append another shape into your object, or you can duplicate the one that you're working on right now. But if you wanted to add more layers, like basic primitive shapes, you can import them with append, and it'll kind of just make a new one. And you're kind of like, oh no, where's my stuff? How do I move this primitive to make it maybe like a torso if the circle is a head? Well, there is a tool in here, and it's called transpose. And it basically just gives you a little gizmo that you can move around your little primitives and all that stuff before you get to sculpting. And as we start to make more layers, we'll actually get into more complex processing of these shapes as we get into them more. Yes, she is like the Maya Gizmo. We love her. All right, I have retrieved my water. um, so a couple questions. What do we do if we accidentally deselect a really complex mask? That is a really good question. If you have, let's say, we've selected a bunch of different parts. I'm just actually gonna make a smiley face because I think that would be cool. Okay, let's say that we've selected this and we want to do a bunch of stuff to it, but we've accidentally deselected it. We have the undo history here, and the undo history will also include the, what's it called? The masking history that we've worked on. So we can go all the way back before all of our other masks that we made. And this top bar with the undo is very powerful when it comes to deselecting and selecting all that good stuff. We good. Um, which button was it that we needed to invert the sculpting masks? All right, so if we wanted to invert our selection mask, so let's go back to our history. If we want to invert the selection mask, we're just holding down click and we're holding down control and we're clicking outside of here. It's just left click and it'll invert. If we click and drag, however, it'll turn off the the thing. But the history is very powerful when it comes to, say you accidentally click and drag, and you've lost it. You can hit Control Z, or you can come up here. And you have history for every single one of your subtools, which is really awesome. Where do we go for the transpose tool again? So the transpose tool is actually just within our brushes. It kind of acts like its own unique brush. Um, it'll be down here. There's a bunch of different kinds of transpose you can do, but mainly just use the main one. Um, and up here, you'll notice that all of our recently used brushes will pop up here. So it's really useful for if you don't want to find it in here, because sometimes it gets really disorienting when you have to look at so many different brushes. But it'll just be transposed. There's a lot of different things you can do with it. Like notice that it's um only working on our um this. Isn't that weird? Um, is there a hotkey for transpose? Sadly, there is not that I'm aware of. Um, yeah. But, do we have to clear history like in Maya? No, actually, when you close the file, you'll lose access to your history, I'm pretty sure. Just to be safe, I would make sure that there's nothing in there that you want to keep. All right, so if we're good with questions for the UI and sculpting, we'll move on to our toolbox. All right, let's move on to the toolbox. So earlier, sorry, I'm losing my breath. Oop. Um, so we have the tools over here. We have our tool, our project file, Polymesh 3D. We got our subtools. Remember, we got them like the master file window from Photoshop. We got the Polymesh 3Ds like our files open in Photoshop. Then we got our subtools like our layers in Photoshop. Um, something really cool is that in the toolbox, you'll notice that you can scroll down and there's so many different things that you can do. Um, specifically talking about the different tabs that you can access, there's so many different cool things. I mainly just have Subtool open unless I'm doing something really, really weird specific. Um, but in Subtool, there's a lot of different options. We can make our subtools go into different folders, like new folder, blah. And we can rename the folders, we can rename the objects, subtools, copy, duplicate, delete, append, adding new ones to our Polymesh 3D. You can merge them down, merge similar, whatever, all that good stuff. Um, yeah, there's a lot of different cool stuff up here too. That's pretty much just like Photoshop layers, like merging layers and all that good stuff. But merging is kind of scary because if you were to merge down, you'll get a little message that says it's not an undoable operation. Since you have history for each of your subtools, your computer is kind of like, okay, you want to undo, but it's thinking that you want to undo what you did to the subtool itself and not what you did in the program itself. So if I were to draw on here, you can see that I'm building history up here on the top. And I can undo and I can do all that. I can hit Control Z and I'll undo. Shift Z on redo. But if I merge it down, I'll hit OK. It's not an undoable operation. You'll see that we lose our history of merging them together. So if you have anything on the square, for example, you'll lose the history on that. And maybe you can sometimes get away with undoing things on this, but you'll also be losing the history of having them together and untogether. You cannot undo merging. Um, it's kind of scary, but that's why it's always good to have backups of your files and all that stuff. I like to Control S like every 2 seconds, and it even makes you confirm where you want to save your projects. Every single time it makes you overwrite your old one or override it and all that good stuff. But it's just a good thing to keep in mind. It's usually good practice to have good backups and all that. Um, so closing out this, we've pretty much gone over basically everything that we'll be using for Subtool, but now we can move down to geometry. There's a lot of tools that let us modify, for example, the density of the mesh. It's kind of low quality right now. Let us add divisions, mirror our mesh across the axis just to make sure everything's perfectly symmetrical and so forth. There's a lot of different things here. I'm not going to go too deep into a bunch of different ones, but the most important ones for now are Dynamesh, which is right here, ZRemesher, and modify topology mainly for one specific function within it. um, when you hear people talking about ZBrush, a lot of times people will praise the Dynamesh function of ZBrush because it is very awesome and useful. Specifically when you're blocking in shapes, combining primitive shapes that you've sculpted. Let's say, for example, you're making a hand, and it's built out of a bunch of squares. When you merge all of them together in your subtool, I'll whip something up actually because it's kind of hard to envision it with nothing to reference. So really quickly, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a little hand with blocky little shapes. You can see that we can duplicate it, move everything around. I'm not going to bother making joints and all that and making it super perfectly atomically correct, but just for the sake of visualizing what this function does, let's bring it over here. We're giving her 4 fingers. Classic. So we've got all these, right? We've blocked in our character. Let's say we've sculpted it a little bit more, all that good stuff. So we got all our things. We merge them all together. You can hit always okay, but when you're starting out, it's always good to have confirmation. So we merged all our primitive shapes together. And let's go ahead and just make our brush really big, hold down shift and smooth it out. Womp womp. So you got all these shapes together, and you'll notice that when we merge everything together, we're losing out on things being connected because we've only merged them and the geometry isn't communicating with each other. So if we go to geometry and we go to Dynamesh, what it's going to do is when you merge your objects together, they're separated by topology, edge loops, all that good stuff until you manually combine them. Say you were to do that in Maya or in here. But with Dynamesh, the objects are kind of seamed, like sewed together. And you can focus on like sculpting form instead of worrying about like complex topology and stuff while you're still blocking out your character and refining it. Topology is something that you'll worry about mainly later for like Maya animation, all that good stuff. But for the moment of truth, we'll hit Dynamesh. You'll notice that it makes kind of like a little seam around where things are connecting. So if we go to smooth it out more, you'll see that the density of our topology has increased a scary amount. For example, I'll show the wireframe and you'll see that it's getting super dense. It gives us a lot more flexibility when it comes to things like the damn standard tool. Let's say you wanted to make the hand seem just kind of blocking out things. You'll notice that we have some connection here that we wouldn't want in a normal model. But for the sake of showing off the Dynamesh function, this is good enough. So with um, sculpting is kind of just like blocking out all the shapes, refining it, making not worrying about topology. Don't have to worry about that until you want to animate it or render it specifically later. It's nice to just have an option that lets you focus on the sculpture's form and not so much its technical density, which is another great thing about ZBrush being in 2.5D. It allows you to have a lot of points in your scene without worrying about like optimization for animation and all that crazy good stuff, which you'll worry about later. But right now, you're just worrying about the 3D sculpture's form, which is really cool. Tessa says Dynamesh is basically just Blender's remesh, which is pretty much it. Yeah, that's it. I think they have a weird thing called like Topo or something, which is honestly pretty much a similar thing to this, but it's pretty neat. You notice that we have Dynamesh on. It'll subdivide things as we move them, which is nice for just worrying about the form again, like I mentioned. But it's nice. And let's say we've got all our stuff going. Let's say we just want like a basic cleanup of our model. You could use Dynamesh again to, I guess, lower the resolution, but you notice that things get connected because it's like, these two are close together, so I'm gonna optimize it and make it super close together and bridge them together, even though that's definitely not what you want. That's when we'll move on to ZRemesher. What you can do is you can half the amount of points that you have. You can keep the amount of points the same while having a better flow of the topology. You can duplicate or double the amount of points that you have on your object, or you could just try and find a target amount. It's pretty hit and miss with this one, just because you have to kind of eyeball it. You can keep the creases and stuff that you make, detect the edges of your model, and you'll notice that when we hit ZRemesher, it'll take a little minute. Sit back, relax, take a breath. But you'll notice that it looks a lot more animatable, I guess, with quotes, in terms of edge flow, in terms of cleanliness. Not mentioning the bridge here that happened with Dynamesh earlier, but ZRemesher is great for when you have too many divisions and want to like optimize your model for flow, or if you wanted to increase your object's mesh density based on what you have already. I mentioned earlier that you can double it, which is really cool because it'll keep that same flow while just basically subdividing it, or the smooth tool within Maya. And the main thing about ZRemesher that makes it so good is that it won't bridge together objects like Dynamesh. Like if you had the fingers and all that other stuff merged all together, the topology was separate, and how we were talking about how Dynamesh brings together those topology. Um, ZRemesher doesn't actually bridge the topology. It'll kind of just remesh the different objects within your merged subtool, which is really cool. It gives you a bunch of different options for different use case scenarios. But it's very nice that it keeps creases, detects edges, all that good stuff. It adapts to the flow of your model, which is pretty cool. And now moving on to modify topology. There's a bunch of crazy stuff in here. The main thing, which is my baby, and I love it so much, is the mirror and weld tool, which will do exactly as it says. It kind of just mirrors and welds it. You'll notice these little tiny X, Y, and Z. If you click them, it'll do it in different ways. It's pretty cool. Um, it just does what it wants. You could mirror it across multiple axes. If you have, for say, example, if you have an eye on this side, it'll mirror to the other side. If you have an eye on this side, it'll mirror to the other side. It kind of detects which side has the better topology. Sorry for the dog bark if y'all heard that. All right. So we've talked about the geometry drop-down box. There's a lot of really powerful tools when it comes to density of your points, optimizing it and mirroring it and all that good stuff. I won't get too into dynamic subdivision just because it's a bit. Um, so we've gone over the geometry tab. We've talked about Dynamesh, ZRemesher, the difference between them. We talked about the one tool in modified Retopology, which is pretty neat. Honestly, you only really use mirror and weld if you forgot to hit the X button, or if Dynamesh for some reason doesn't like to symmetry your Retopology or whatever that is. But mainly, unless you're making something that was made to stay in ZBrush, I mainly personally just use ZBrush to make a like a high poly character that I'll bring into Maya and retopologize, which we'll talk about later. But honestly, it should be good. We should ball. We should ball. So we've gone over geometry, and now we won't talk about anything else in here except for deformation. You may be thinking, what the heck are we doing here? um, let's say you had an earring on one side. Let's make that earring. Hey, okay, ring 3D. Looking like Sonic's hand here. Okay, we'll talk about. Okay, let's say this is an earring on this person's head. um, let's say that you want the earring to, instead of like mirror and welding it on both sides, you just want it on the other side. Then deformation, guess what you can do? You can mirror it. That's pretty much it. That's all I use this for. There's a lot of really cool, powerful tools in here that I won't talk about right now, but you can mirror it. It's pretty cool. It's really weird, out of place function, but it's pretty useful. It just reflects the subtool along your axis. I guess if you were working in geometry, and let's say you mirrored and welded, you could technically change it by mirroring it in deformation and then mirroring it, welding it, I suppose. Untested. Should theoretically work. Um, all right. So those are basically all of the tools that you'll be using for making a character or making whatever you want in here. You can make miniatures. Um, I made my little character in here and then I retopologized to him in Maya. Um, honestly, it's pretty cool. There's a lot of different really powerful things you can do in ZBrush. And honestly, once you've learned the UI, it's kind of awesome. Kind of awesome sauce. So I'm thinking we should take a little breather. um, there's a lot of stuff we went over just now too. Scared for time at all. I did not make this in 5 minutes. No, this is my son. This is the guy that I modeled and all that stuff for the rig. But when you're starting to sculpt, but it's basically moving from very blocky shapes into the more refined details. We ball, we ball. So let's say you've blocked in your character, you've sculpted all you want, and now you're ready to move them into Maya. I'm an open book right now. I'm gonna go over retopology in Maya because it is something that is 100%. It's very challenging, but it's also very, once you get it, it's kind of like the pearly gates have opened and you can make whatever you want and you can animate it and you can rig it and you can do whatever you want. So this is my character. His name is Rue and he is a little fox. Let's say we've modeled him, we've sculpted him. He's beautiful, he's gorgeous. And now he is intended for animation. So if we go into our wireframe, we'll see all this crazy topology. If I wanted to animate this and give him bones, we would be spending hours on render time. We'd be spending hours on weight painting all this. It's just too much. It's just way too much. And honestly, it can look really bad if we try to deform it because the edge flow is not working here. Like there's no set flow for these edges. If I wanted to close the eye, we would see how all these faces would be interlocking and all that gross stuff, which we do not want when we're animating. Um, so we have our character. He's sculpted. He's beautiful. I'll only be talking about the upper half because anything for here can flow to the bottom in the same kind of retopology aspect. So we have our Polymesh 3D selected. We've got all our subtools, our layers. So now we can go to Z plugin. We want to export him as a FBX because if we go to export here, what it'll do is it'll export only one of these subtools we have selected. So if we have this selected, it'll only export this as an OBJ. But we want everything to bring into Maya. So what we'll do is we'll go to Z plugin, FBX, export. Everything visible, honestly. We don't really want to do selected because we can only have one selected here at a moment. We don't want all because there's a bunch of different tools and stuff that I use that we don't really want to import because that would get a little messy and we have to spend a bunch of time cleaning it up and all that crap. The basic settings here are good. So we'll just go to Z plugin. We'll export him. And I'm just going to put him on my desktop.
ZBrush high poly sculpt. Yes.
All right. So we'll see it doing its magic. Cool. So now I'll minimize ZBrush. Now we have this screen showing. And so we'll just open a new Maya file. For the sake of the demonstration, I'm not going to bother making a new project folder and all that jazz. But remember, we've saved it to our desktop. So we'll just import our FBX file by dragging and dropping it into Maya. And if you have a high poly character, it will take a little minute to import. But you'll notice that we have to select them. This is like unacceptable. We cannot be animating with this. So what I like to do is I'll turn off my grid. I'll select my whole character and I'll just combine him. And so now he's one big mesh, right? I'll delete my history, all that jazz. And so I'll just turn on the default material so it looks more familiar. And within Maya, a really, really cool thing is that when we sculpt something that we're going to use for animation, we got to retopologize it for optimizing it for deforming and all that good stuff. But you can import it to Maya and you can make it what's called a live surface. If you've been wiggling around the workspace, the UI here, you'll notice this thing that says no live surface. And we didn't really talk about it in class because we didn't really do any sculpting. But what it does is I'll hide this for now and just show you what it can do to a square. So we see we got a square. When I make it a live surface, we can't select it. This is because what a live surface is similar to snapping it to a curve or snapping it to a certain point or snapping it to the grid or whatever. Your points and manipulation of anything that you're doing is going to be snapped to the faces of this cube, which when you combine it with the quad draw tool, if you messed around with that in class, it lets you draw in space and create topology as you're going. So when you combine the live surface, which is snapping whatever you're doing to the surface of your object, with the quad draw tool that lets you draw anywhere in space, you get this really cool function where you can draw anywhere on your live object and you can make faces as you're going, which is really powerful when it comes to retopology and all that stuff. And what's really cool about quad draw is that there's so many keyboard and mouse shortcuts that let you do so many cool things to your models. Like if you have an edge loop, you can extrude it, and there's just so many cool things that you can do with quad draw. And so we've had it on this cube, right? But if I were to exit, I'll delete my cube, whatever. I'll delete my thing. So let's pop up this. What happens when you make your sculpt a live surface and you use your quad draw? You can literally draw your topology onto your mesh, which is literally insane. Oopsies. So what you can do is you can make your sculpt the high poly, high resolution sculpt, you can make that into something you can literally just draw topology on. And when it comes to optimizing your character for animation, getting those essential edge loops like the mouth, the eyes, the ears, and the fingers especially, um, it just makes it makes your life so much easier than say if you were box modeling this character. Um, when you're box modeling, one thing that happens a lot, especially I ran into it when I was first starting out. A lot of my models looked a little clunky, like especially with something as organic as like a character, like a face, um, something that needed to be sculpted in comparison to box modeling it, maybe for something like a table or like a cup, is you lose a lot of the fluidity that comes with sculpting when you're box modeling. So when you sculpt your character, you get to move these organic shapes all around however you want. Don't even have to worry about topology. When you're box modeling, you have to worry about topology. You have to, they got you in the minds like going crazy over topology, and you don't even know what the character's supposed to look like yet because you're still sculpting it, you're still fleshing it out. I mean, you have the character sheet, but it can only take you so far when you're working in 3D, which is why sculpting is like my baby because it helps you like experiment with how you want different things to look, like how different expressions can look and all that good stuff. And so you have the ability to make organic shapes. Don't worry about topology, all that good stuff. And then you can come in later and you can make your topology as clean and perfect as you want it. And with the Quadra tool, there's so many different functions that let you optimize your topology. And it's just pretty cool. But you can see how we can just draw the loop around this eye. And when we deselect it, we go into object mode, we just have it. Like it's just there. It's on top of our sculpt, which is really nice. It just gives you a lot of freedom. Box modeling does have its advantages, but when it comes to organic shapes, sculpting, it is personal preference at the end of the day, but sculpting gives you a lot more freedom, a lot more room for experimentation and all that good stuff. So you can just select your object, go to live object, live surface up here. It's just a little magnet. And once you've opened Quadra, you can just draw on it. Like it'll automatically snap to it. It's so cool. It's my baby. I love it. Um, for reference, what I'm doing is I'm just left clicking to make the points. And then if you hold down shift, it'll try and automatically find where you can make squares. It's pretty cool. But there is a lot of keyboard and mouse shortcuts in the modeling toolkit. It's also in the tool settings. Um, it's just cool. Just a lot of cool things. That's pretty much it. Um, I can open up my file that has the finished topology that I made for this, and I can kind of highlight the essential loops or different things within it. I'm trying to open it. This is an anthropomorphic character, so it's going to be a little different than maybe a human, but the same basics still apply. I wish I had my camera that I could show you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide all the controllers for the rig because that's not really what we're talking about right now. But if I turn on the wireframe, ignore the darker edges here, but I'll go to my channel box and I'll edit some of the model. All right. So you'll see that in terms of edge loops, we've got some going around the eye. And what you get is sort of this superhero mask. So I'll take a screenshot here actually, so I can draw over that. Okay, cool. So you can see that what we've got going on here is we got this superhero mask going all the way around the eyes, and it's making a full loop like a circle. There's no interruptions in it at all. Um, it's just very important that you have this sort of superhero mask, as well as one whole circle. Well, you'll have more circles, but just for the sake of demonstration, there is a circle around the eye. So you have the superhero mask out here, and then you'll have some more loops in here. It's really important that you don't just have one loop. It looks like it in this photo, but there isn't. Um, it's important that you have a lot of loops around the eye because when you have deformations that close the eye, your eye is going to go down here. And if you don't have enough divisions in your eyelid, you're going to have some blocky geometry that's going to make it look really weird. There are times when you can get away with it if you're using that hyper smooth mode, which is what's happening here, which is why there's like curved faces. But it's really important that you have enough divisions around the eye so when you close it, it doesn't get crunchy and you don't have super deformed textures. It's another reason why oftentimes people will model their character with the eyes half closed because it'll reduce the amount of stretching that happens when you're closing the eye, when you're opening the eye. The textures, it's kind of like how you have an eyelid right now. If you look at your own eyelid, you'll notice that there's skin in between, um, like your eyelash and your eye bone kind of thing. And when you close your eye, the skin is stretching. When you have an eyeball in the game and your eye is closing, the skin is stretching. So the texture that'll be here will be deforming and it might be too much, honestly. If I go back to the rig, actually, I have it shown. If I close the eye, you'll notice that these faces are stretching very. Oh, that's not supposed to happen. You'll notice that these faces are stretching, and I was able to get away with it by using Hypersmooth, but in the future, I maybe wouldn't have the eyelid close with such intense stretching. Because my character here is made of fabric, it kind of lets me get away with certain things. So I'm allowed to get away with stretching. But in terms of human skin, that would look kind of scary. So I would advise that you have more edge loops around the eye so that when it's closing, it's good. Um, the eyes are very important when it comes to topology and all that stuff. And especially, you'll notice the nose has its own set of loops. This is because on a human nose, you have creases and all that stuff, and you kind of want those to be embedded within a circle. So I am going to turn off my screen really quick so I can pull up a really cool model that Christina sent me. So when you're making a character, I'm going to kind of narrate this while I'm typing, so it's going to be a little choppy. Okay, so when you're making a character, when you're using quad draw on your high resolution sculpt, you want to sort of outline with edge loops what is going to be moving. So for example, the eye is a circle. So you're going to have edge loops that go in a circle. And when you close the eye, you're closing the eye, you're closing a circle. So when you're closing the circle, there won't be as much deformations as if maybe if you were making it more of a grid style topology, things would be stretching and tearing apart and all that stuff. But when you have a circle, all you're doing is just squishing the circle. So it makes things a lot more cleaner when you're deforming it. And when you're making characters, I did not make this model, but for the example, you'll see how there's like this really cool set of swirls around the eyeball. Um, that means that when you're making different expressions, they'll deform very cleanly. And especially around the nose, you'll notice that it has its own set of loops that kind of separate it from the rest of the face. It's just cool. The same thing goes for the lips. You got these loops going around the lips. Um, and when you have the circle that goes around the nose and you have the circle that goes around the lips, you'll usually connect them with one big circle that also sometimes can envelope the chin. Like for here, I have these loops that go around the mouth. And what that lets me do is it lets me open the mouth and have a clean movement where the jaw is. And also, because I have this loop here that goes around the mouth, when I have a controller that's moving here, you'll see that it moves really cleanly because that's what it's intended to do. When you have something that you've built intentionally for your topology, it just makes it so much more cleaner when it comes to animation and all that good stuff. Same thing with the fingers. When you got those edge loops and you got those different things going on, it makes it so much easier to deform it, way cleaner. And it just makes your life a lot easier. I'm not going to get into rigging or anything like that. I'm just talking about how topology is pretty much based on how you're going to deform it or what you intend to do with your model. It's really important that you have a good understanding of the edge loops, mainly the eyes, the eyelids, the mouth, and the nose and the chin. Would you recommend starting on human like characters for retopology, or is there something a bit easier that might be better? Um, Honestly, I think that if you are up to the challenge, starting on a face is like the most brutal way to just kind of learn things trial by fire. I mean, there are different things that you could retopologize using the live surface and the quadra, but in terms of organic modeling and sculpting characters that you want to use for animation, I think that human characters are the best way for gaining the understanding of where things are supposed to be flowing when you're modeling for animation. I guess if that makes sense. Like you could start out with yeah. I feel like the human face is kind of just something that parts of it that are very essential to get right. And once you have those essential things that you've gotten right, you can apply them to different things, kind of like anthropomorphic characters, like this one, um, which still has some errors, such as the eyelid, eye loops, and the creases here. But humans are just the way to go with that sort of thing. I'm also gonna stop recording because that's a thing. All right, that's pretty much it for the video. Let me know in the comments if it helped, and hopefully I can make more. Thank you. Bye bye.